Welcome everybody again to another episode of the ideaXme show that profiles humans behind the really big ideas that are shaping our world, inspiring the future creators, and for all those really great stories. I'm Ira Pastor, your life sciences ambassador along for the journey today. So intelligence is broadly defined as the ability to either acquire or apply new knowledge and skills. The National Intelligence University is a federally chartered research university which serves as the United States Intelligence Community Institute for Higher Learning in fields central to the study and the profession of intelligence and national security. The National Intelligence University programs emphasize education through scholarly and applied research, ultimately designed to help the United States intelligence officers better understand the range of issues, geopolitical, strategic, technological threats facing the country. The universe is organized into two units. There's a College of Strategic Intelligence and the Oettinger School of Science and Technology Intelligence. And combined, these colleges cover a wide range of topics related to international affair issues, adversarial threats and capabilities, which range from cultural and religious conflicts, weapons of mass destruction, proliferation, cybersecurity, terrorism, transnational crime, and a wide range of other things. It is the only university in the United States where students study and complete research at so-called top secret, sensitive, compartmentalized level. We're honored today to be joined by Dr. Brian Holmes, who is the Dean at the School of Science and Technology Intelligence, which in National Intelligence University. And this school is the focus for both science and technical analytical education, research, and external engagement across intelligent national security communities. Dr. Holmes received his Ph.D. in chemistry from Clemson University and is a synthetic chemist, research multiple disciplinary areas of science, including aspects of nanotechnology and crystal engineering. He did his postdoc work at University of Minnesota Department of Chemical Engineering and Material Sciences, where he did research on organic semiconductors. And then he did a 2-year American Society Engineering Education Fellowship within the U.S. Naval Research Laboratory in D.C., studying nanotransistors. Dr. Holmes has also served as an all-sorts intelligence analyst and branch chief in the Defense Intelligence Agency, or DIA, the Counterproliferation Support Office from 2006 to 2010. And then he accepted a managerial position at the Directorate for Analysis Staff Operations Division. He was a direct commissioned intelligence officer for the U.S. Navy Reserve, and he served from 2007 to 2011 and reached the rank of lieutenant. And for 3 years, he supported the Afghanistan-Pakistan Task Force as an all-sorts intelligence analyst in the DIA's Director of Intelligence. From 2012 to 2016, Dr. Holmes has chaired the Emerging and Disruptive Technology, Geostrategic Resource and Environment, and Weapons of Mass Destruction concentrations in the National Intelligence University. He serves as an executive representative to the Scientific and Technological Intelligence Committee under the auspices of the National Intelligence Council and directly supports the U.S. National Intelligence Priority Framework. He's primarily focused on dual-use technology research and the translation of various emerging research and development fronts into advanced materials for military systems. From 2016 to 2017, Dr. Holmes became the Associate Dean at the Science and Technology Intelligence School, and they became Dean in September of 2017. Dr. Holmes holds patents with the U.S. Navy, has published numerous peer-reviewed scientific studies. He received the Deputy Director of a National Intelligence for Analysis Distinguished Analysis Award, in addition to the National Intelligence Meritorious Unit Citation. And in August of 2017, qualified for the prestigious academic title Professor of Intelligence. And as a disclaimer to this show, I would like to say at this point that the views expressed by Dr. Holmes today are his. They do not represent official policy or position of the National Intelligence University, the Department of Defense, or any of its components, or the U.S. government. All that being said, Dr. Holmes, thank you for taking the time to come on the show today.
It's my pleasure, Ira. I appreciate it.
Absolutely, absolutely. So, we typically, as we have on the show, start off by really giving our guests the floor for a little while, just to talk about themselves, sort of the big picture of who you are. If you can really take us back to the beginning on, where you grew up, how you developed this interest in science and chemistry, and a little bit of your journey through academia, the military, and of course, into the intelligence domain. That'll be a really great introduction.
Sure, it's definitely a journey. There's a lot of steps, clearly. So my journey actually began, I was a Kodak kid in Rochester, New York.
Excellent.
So at the time, it was primarily in the 80s. My father was a typical father. He had a PhD in chemistry from the University of Illinois, and him and many of his lab mates were actually literally plucked up and hired from that lab, to include some of the engineers over there too in the engineering department. And they were brought over to Kodak as PhD scientists to work in some of the research and development and manufacturing components of Kodak. At the time, certainly in the 80s, Kodak was still not only a national treasure in the U.S., but it was, of course, a international, real powerhouse in film. So not only film, but really science and technology, manufacturing technologies, R&D, and all the things that we kind of relate. Certainly, my generation relates to Kodak back at the height of its kind of what we call power as a business.
Mine too.
And the interesting thing is, my father, was a typical father. All of my parents' friends, they worked at Kodak. Most of them were scientists. In some cases, both parents were at Kodak. And it is, in fact, quite the norm to not only be a scientist, but have a PhD. So lots of people have PhD in chemistry, lots of people have PhD in engineering. And for this rare, I'd say small percentage of people we knew who were not at Kodak, they were at like Xerox and Bausch & Lomb at the time. And we had local institutions that were actually even bigger now. They also kind of intermixed with the local businesses that were also kind of powerhouses in science. So University of Rochester was right downtown, and they're actually very big right now up in Rochester. And then our Rochester Institute of Technology, RIT, was kind of a local academic player as well. And so that was my ecosystem. It was a baseline norm to grow up, to go into science, get a science degree, then get a PhD in science, and then work at a place like Kodak or Xerox or Bausch & Lomb. And that was our wild baseline in the 80s. And that's really all I knew. Now, at the same time, my mother, she was a teacher. So my mother taught kind of a smorgasbord of levels between K through 12, including special ed. I actually have still really fond memories of the interactions my mother had with the special ed students. They're usually fairly young, kind of early development special ed. I have incredible, really kind of I'm amazed at that community of teachers. They have a challenge that I could never really comprehend. So I applaud them for them, but I gained a great respect for the teaching profession. And then later, after my father passed away in high school, my mother ended up becoming an adjunct at the local community college called Monroe Community College. And Monroe is a fairly big community college. And I gained a very unique understanding of the importance of community colleges, both for students that want to gain a two-year degree. And if the community college was set up in a very good way, and it could pipeline, that two-year degree could pipeline into their local community with the businesses in the community, and then get a job in that community. And for a number of other students, of course, they use the community colleges as a platform to hopefully transfer into a four-year degree and then kind of move on. So I came from a family in which one side was teachers, and the other side were these kind of powerhouse scientists. And then on top of it, even though it didn't really, at the time, I didn't really have a clear understanding contextually about what it meant. But not only that, but I found out much later that, of course, friends of my parents, childhood friends' parents, they actually worked in national security programs at Kodak. So for those that know, and a lot of this has been long since declassified at this point, Kodak was sponsored significantly through contracts with the federal government during the height of the Cold War. Kodak was of course, world expert in film, in optics, and in imagery.
Sure.
And so, during the height of the Cold War, Kodak was a big supporter on the back end in a very secretive way. No one ever talked about what they did. It's a little bit different nowadays, it seems like, anyways, with social media and everything. No one ever talked what they did, but there are many scientists at Kodak that supported national security programs, and they supported those programs and supported defense as well as U.S. intelligence. So it's kind of an interesting path. And from there, I ended up, due to a number of circumstances, I went, as you mentioned, to University of Delaware. I think you mentioned it, and where I got a chemistry degree. Now, that was easy to translate at Delaware because for those that know anything about Delaware, we didn't call it the University of Delaware.
Yep.
We called it the University of DuPont. Okay, so if you got out of there, guess what? We came out of the University of DuPont. Much like what I grew up with in Rochester, where Kodak was this huge player. It had a huge influence on not only other businesses around, but the profession, as well as funding local research. The same thing was very similar, analogous at Delaware, because DuPont was right down the road.
Sure.
And Delaware became well known in, science and engineering. But DuPont, of course, was heavily influenced a lot of different areas. So there's not a school. I mean, I think I remember even the music school was something like Lamont DuPont, School of Music or something like this, because DuPont was such a major influence there. And so it wasn't a hard translation for me there because it seemed similar to what I grew up with. And then from there, I have to be honest, when I was an undergrad, I majored in chemistry, but I had a minor in history. So I had I did have a little bit of social science in my background, and I loved history enough to get a minor in it. But at the time, I have to be honest, I wasn't really sure what I wanted to do. I got very lucky my senior year of college because one of the requirements in undergrad was to take one graduate level course in chemistry. And it was, the one good thing was I get to choose it. So I chose a graduate level course in inorganic chemistry. And I ended up loving, first of all, the area. I really appealed to me. So I have to be honest, I didn't like some of the other areas so much, like analytical chemistry. That's for a certain kind of person. It wasn't for me so much. I loved inorganic. And I think most importantly, I was in a class with a lot of other grad students. There's a couple of undergrads, but mostly grad students. I was able to kind of hold my own in the class. I helped build confidence, and I loved the substance of the class. And it was really there that I kind of gained that confidence to suddenly say, well, you know what, maybe grad school is, a possibility for me. Up until that point, I had no idea really what I wanted to do. I was just kind of getting through undergrad. I had great conversations with my teacher in that class. I had a really good conversation with my department chair at the time, I think his son ended up going to Clemson of all places. And my teacher in my grad class, somehow he knew about the department down there. And for whatever reason, just the name kept coming up. And they had very good people in inorganic chemistry. Like a gentleman, even though I didn't pick him as chair, there's a very famous fluorine chemist at the time by the name of Darryl DeMarteau. He was down in Clemson at the time. And so, as a result, I decided very late in the game, you know what, I'm going to try to apply to this school just for a master's degree. And that's what I did. It was the best thing that could happen. When I went down there, I got very lucky. I ended up getting a very good chair. We talk later about mentors. He ended up becoming a very good mentor for me. He gave me this enormous amount of growth in the fields that I care about. And I found out that I was doing very well down there. I like small classes. I like knowing who my teachers were, and they knew me. I couldn't say that at Delaware necessarily. I liked the creative freedom of a lab environment. I thought it was a very unique environment that for me was exactly what someone with my personality needed, in which I could kind of grow and try to be creative and innovative in a way that I hadn't been up to that point. I hadn't done badly, hadn't done great. I just need a different kind of environment. And so from there, yes, I went to a real famous department, at the University of Minnesota. I worked in Amundsen Hall. So Amundsen is named after Neil Amundsen. Neil Amundsen is considered by many as the father of modern chem engineering. And in fact, today as a dean, we talk about later, what does it mean to be a dean at National Talents University? A lot of the influence, certainly in the way I frame everything from hiring to culture to the importance of interdiscipline, right, which the intelligence community is all about, is interdiscipline. A lot of those things I kind of gain a sense for, a framework for, by learning about Neil Amundsen when I was at the Department of Chemical Engineering in Minnesota. Now, it was there that I had a fateful conversation. I ended up talking to a friend of mine who I knew from high school, and who I think at the time was living in Chicago, and he worked at McKinsey. But probably more importantly, he was in the Marine Corps. He was in the reserves. Yeah. And I remember talking to him about professions, and he had a very diverse viewpoint. I just talked to scientists at that point. He was not. And I talked about doing something unique with my background degree, but I had no idea what that was. I briefly thought about being a patent examiner at the USPTO, which some do with PhDs in science.
Sure.
And I have good friends that did. And because I think of his experience in national security and Marine Corps, he literally brought up, well, why don't you look in the U.S. intelligence community? At which point I said, what is that? I don't know much about him, and why on earth would they need a scientist? I really didn't know. And somewhere along the line, he also brought up the fact that the US Navy had a very unique commissioning program, a direct commission program. It was for, if I recall correctly, basically JAGs, medical, and intelligence. So Navy intelligence through a direct commission. It was really set up to try to gain people with, I'll be honest, a little bit older, so not 22-year-olds, as officers who had very unique experiences and backgrounds that you wouldn't get from a 22-year-old new officer.
Got it.
And it was at that point that I started doing my homework. I learned a little bit more, and most importantly, I was able to find my way to DC. So my decision was, I need to get to DC, or this area, National Capital Region. I need to do more. I need to learn more about it. And maybe by going to a place, if I'm lucky, like a naval research laboratory, I could learn more about, the services, defense, what it means to do research in that kind of world. And then maybe kind of pound the pavement and learn more about the US intelligence community. And that's exactly what happened. I got that fellowship. And lo and behold, right next to me, if for those that don't know where Naval Research Lab is, it's in the southeast corner of Washington, D.C. Right next to Naval Research Laboratory is Bolling Air Force Base. So Bolling Air Force Base is very well known for having, I think, Marine Corps One on Bolling Air Force Base. Okay. But just as importantly, the Defense Intelligence Agency, DIA, is actually centered in and has a home base there. So I found out about them. I gained, I wouldn't say a low-level clearance, but I basically became kind of part of the club by joining the Naval Research Lab. Mm-hmm. And one of the fascinating things about DC is they have these crazy things called like clear job fairs. And I'll never forget going to, literally, I got in, they checked credentials. I'll never forget going to like a hotel in Arlington, Virginia, and literally going around this hotel and going to different, what were really rooms in a hotel. Mm-hmm. And finding and being interviewed by all these different kind of both public and private, entities. Sure. That were in the cleared environment that were kind of looking for applicants. I thought it was wild. I can imagine. It was very vivid. I mean, it was like, this is kind of like what I, see in movies or things like this. And as a result, I end up really just sending my resume everywhere. That's what you had to do. And what you find in DC is, I mean, to be honest, everybody has a great resume. It's really a bit of a gamemanship. You always have to figure out how you can get to the top just to have, just to get a call back. And so that's what I did. And so something like 13 months later, so this was folks who want to get into business. It's all about patience. Sure. 13 months later, after applying to the Defense Intelligence Agency, I got a random phone call out of nowhere that said, hey, we got your application. It's for an entry-level position. We want to interview you over the next 2 weeks. Can you come over? And of course, my immediate response was, wait, who are you? And I don't even remember putting this in. That was like a year ago. But yes, I'll go over there. I'll see what you have to offer and try to find out. And, it obviously worked out. And I ended up getting a position as an entry-level junior analyst. I was an all-source analyst in the counter-proliferation support office, specifically as a chemical warfare analyst. Mm-hmm. Now, at the same time, about 6 months later, I had actually gained a commission, in the U.S. Navy Reserves as an ensign, so an O1, brand new, what we call butter bar. Okay. In the Navy. So in my early 30s, I think it was around 31 or something like this, I literally had gone kind of full tilt left and gone from kind of a scientist that had worked in academic and a little bit in the defense lab, doing just primarily basic R&D. Mm-hmm. And I was a bench chemist, to suddenly immersed in this kind of wild world that was U.S. intelligence. And to some extent, I had no idea what I was getting into, but I decided this is what I want to try. So I did it, and I was kind of full in. And so that's what occurred. And so that kind of translated in intelligence is a funny business. A lot of times when you first get in, that's not necessarily where you want to be, but you don't really know what you want to be. Mm-hmm. Because even though you get in the door, Intel, I hate to tell you, you sometimes don't even know what's going on down the hall. Yeah. And so it takes years just to find out, are you in the right place? What other places exist? Are there other opportunities? And then how on earth do I reach that point? Now, 2010, something fateful happened. My agency had what are known as BRACs. They're base realignment enclosures. In some circles, they're very infamous because it usually denotes some significant changes that occur. Some people like, some don't. In my case, the chief of staff for our agency decided that for many of the personnel in my agency that had backgrounds in science and technology, so if you had a portfolio, it was very S&T-ish, they were going to essentially physically move you and your office or components of your office to completely different locations. One of the primary locations they moved people to was Charlottesville, Virginia. Now, Charlottesville is beautiful. I visited. I've done some work down there with a lot of colleagues. But at the time, I was engaged. We had an apartment in DC. My wife had a great job. She didn't want to leave. It was very stressful. And I made the fateful decision to just take whatever job I could get in my agency, hoping things would just kind of settle out. And so at that point, I was a branch chief in the counter-proliferation office. I moved up a little bit since I came in. And I ended up taking a position that I never in my career would I ever thought I got into. I just took it because I needed a position. And I ended up becoming a branch chief up in a directorate headquarters, what we call staff ops.
Okay.
Really not a position someone with my background would normally come into. But I maintained a position, and it was maybe one of the most important positions I had to this date, because what happens in those positions is you sit at a kind of very high level of your agency, and you suddenly see and start to understand how the sausage is really made at a very corporate level. So what our branch was responsible for were basically what we call taskers. That's the intelligence community and the analytic side is all about taskers. You have a customer. We have a huge number of customers at DIA, national level all the way down to military. And customers have requests for information. They need answers to some pressing issue.
Got it.
And that's formalized. We had, thousands and thousands of taskers. Additionally, we had taskers from Congress. In my portfolio included those taskers too. So I gained a real appreciation for what Congress was asking. What is it that Congress wants? They are our primary, they provide oversight, they provide funding.
Absolutely.
I suddenly learned these things, which frankly, as a young analyst, you never find out those things until too late when you kind of reach new heights. But I gained appreciation for it. And I worked in this job until another fateful thing happened. DIA luckily had a mentorship program. They had an internal mentorship program. I decided to test my luck with it. Sometimes they work out, sometimes they don't. And I ended up finding a mentor, and that mentor ended up being someone that had a very unique position at what ended up being the National Intelligence University. And she was a great person, and she introduced me, kind of reintroduced me to a number of people there. I ended up networking. I was reintroduced to the dean, the first dean of the Oettinger School of Science, Technology, Intelligence. It was Dr. Brian Shaw, who later went to become, vice provost at the National Defense University. And I basically engaged with him and the other dean of the College of Strategic Intelligence just to see what the place was all about. Fortunately, a couple months later, he sent me a note and he said, "Hey, we obviously we have a brand new school of S&TI. You have a very unique background. It's hard to get in this kind of institution. We get into that, I think, a little bit later, what it means to work there.
Sure.
And we have our first full-time department chair position open, like ever in this school. Up to you, consider applying." And then he has to stop just to make sure everything's, fair and above board when we do our hiring committees. So I applied, and fortunately, I got in, and that was the summer of 2012. I became a newly minted faculty member and department chair in this brand new school at a time where 2012 was, that summer was the first graduates ever out of the School of S&TI. And ever since then, it's been a kind of amazing journey throughout my time there. And I've been fortunate. I basically had to take just about every position or job there, from being a department chair. At one point, for several years, I was the Institutional Review Board Chair for Human Subject Protection.
Okay.
On behalf of the university, which I'd never, as a bench chemist, it wasn't really something I had ever knew much about. But we have that. We do value those kind of things with our research. And then later, I became associate dean, and then 3 years ago, only the second dean of the Oettinger School. So that's my journey, in a nutshell, from a very proud still Kodak kid, all the way through this kind of really wild assortment of positions to reach the point where I'm at now at the National Intelligence University.
Outstanding, outstanding. I really appreciate that walk through it. And living right now, sort of a stone throw from Delaware,
Yeah,
I understand that DuPont story quite well.
Yeah, the first state. That's right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's a wonderful intro and an amazing path you've had so far. Several months ago, we spent a little time with Dr. Tara O'Toole, who is over at In-Q-Tel and sort of, which more of a sort of intelligence community type of venture capital set up there. And so we introduced this theme about how, the sort of the Hollywood perception of U.S. intelligence is sort of purely the CIA thing, spies and this and that. But the intelligence community is a much broader set of organizations, and Dr. O'Toole went a bit into this. Could you take us on a little bit of an introductory walk sort of through the National Intelligence University, a little bit about its history, where it sits within, I think she mentioned something like 17 different intelligence components. And then, when I think about it, when I first sort of learned about your bio and background, I was like, wow, this guy must be sort of, underneath the Pentagon, or, but you have a campus in Bethesda. I think you have different locations, which I think Bethesda, I think NIH, but walk us through sort of a little bit about where this all sort of is, so people can sort of get a reference.
My pleasure, and actually the timing is great because there's some very historical, unprecedented activities that are actually about to occur at National Intelligence University. So I'll start in the beginning though. So the National Intelligence University was established in 1962. It was 1 year after our parent agency, the Defense Intelligence Agency, was stood up in DIA, so we call it DIA. DIA was stood up in 1961.
Okay.
It's a national level Department of Defense military intelligence centric agency. So we were stood up. We were now in U.S. code as a Title X defense school, a degree granting accredited institution, but we weren't always exactly like that. Right. So we started up as I think what was called the Defense Intelligence School. It was very small. But what was unique is we're essentially, if you look at an org chart, we were literally like a little box incorporated like many other little boxes under the Defense Intelligence Agency. So on the one hand, we're like a unique intelligence component, funded by intelligence money under intelligence authorities. But at the same time, we're an academic institution. Right?
Sure.
It's a little bit of a wild combo. So we were stood up in 1962. We've had a lot of different iterations. I think most important for this audience, so very monumental things happened just under 10 years ago. So we had a very famous Board of Visitor Chair. In the early 2000s, his name was Anthony G. Oettinger. He went by Tony Oettinger. Tony Oettinger was a professor emeritus at Harvard. He's very well known, I think, for information resources.
Okay.
But I think he's even better known for all the contributions he's had to national security. So if you look at his bio, I mean, there is literally not an award or board or study for national security intelligence that he basically hasn't won or sat on at some point or another. I'm pretty sure he's still alive. He retired, as far as I know, out of Harvard, but he's reaching something like 100. And he was very influential as a chair in our board at the institution at that point in the early 2000s. And what he communicated was, so at that point, there was just a college. So what is now known as the College of Strategic Intelligence has basically been the one kind of longstanding institution at what is now NIU. But that college has been around since 1962. But what Tony was able to do is influence the college at the time to make the decision to set aside, to stand up and create essentially a broader academic portfolio centered on what we in the U.S. intelligence community have essentially termed the functional areas. So the functional areas are what we really talk about as S&TI. So what is S&TI? Well, I'll talk a little later about our academic programs, but S&TI is things like weapons of mass destruction. Right? So it's certainly a classic portfolio the intelligence community cares about, but in the community, our lexicon is that's a functional area. And up until that point, there simply wasn't dedicated resources in academic kind of programs that the Board of Visitor members thought we needed to establish to keep pace with the community that we were serving. And so as a result, originally there was like a center, and it was kind of like a team of one.
Mm.
And that first hire was Dr. Brian Shaw.
Okay.
Fast forward, Dr. Brian Shaw kind of started building a team. He brought in, through the Army, he had a gentleman by the name of Dr. Duncan McGill, who's now the dean at Mercyhurst in their Homeland and Intelligence program at Mercyhurst. And the two of them, plus some others, ended up establishing a curriculum centered on this portfolio. And at the same time, most importantly, through a very important memorandum of understanding, we became in 2011 the National Intelligence University. And here's what this means in terms of the USIC. All right, so our parent agency is DIA. At the moment, it's still DIA, but that's actually expected to change next fiscal year. And as a result, the MOU was literally signed between the Defense Intelligence Agency, what was at the time the US, the Undersecretary of Defense for Intelligence, or USDI, and the Director of National Intelligence. So we had this MOU that was kind of a three-part MOU. And we not only become a university, we became what's called in kind of IC speak, a Center for Common Concern. So what does that mean? It means, okay, up to that point, our primary mission area was in support of our parent agency, DIA. When we become a Center for Common Concern in the USIC, and there are several of them, we're not the only one, your primary role is in fact to support the entire US intelligence community. So we went from somewhat supporting primarily DIA to suddenly becoming a university with a school with a new degree, the MSTI degree, that was approved by the Department of Education, like any other degree, with congressional approval as well on the back end, to becoming a school that has a community that spans the who's who of the alphabet soup, in all 17 organizations that include everyone from DHS, INA, to CIA, to NSA, to DIA, to NRO, to Treasury, State Department, all the services, their intelligence components, they are our customers. So when someone says, you're a unique academic who is also an intelligence officer embedded in the USIC, who is your customer? So our customer is the USIC and US intelligence enterprise. And that's by virtue of the MOU, it's by virtue of becoming NIU, it's by virtue of becoming a center of common concern. So that's who we are. Now, who's our staff and our students now? And then what does that mean in a place like, what's our campus, right? So up until recently, we were actually centered in DIA's headquarters at Bolling Air Force Base. We literally live and breathe, much like many intelligence community officers, in what's known as a SCIF. So you read, it's the country's only, federal academic institution that teaches within a TSSCI learning environment. That means SCIF. What is a SCIF? A SCIF is a very secure environment for people that have that kind of clearance. And only people that have that kind of clearance are allowed into that environment. And we have an instruction. I won't go through the details or give you the numbers or acronyms, scare people. But we have an instruction that essentially communicates in summary that we are expected to teach intelligence and use intelligence and all sources of information in our learning environment. And so that's what we do. And as a result, we have to hire staff and faculty who, we're part of the US government. So we're feds, employed by DIA. But the fact is, we have a whole host of people that are not only just employed by DIA, but my institution literally has like agency chairs, so like visiting academic chairs. In their case, they represent the other elements of the USIC. So we have like a CIA chair, we have a DEA chair, we have an FBI chair. We have the services that are there, and they come in on some sort of MOU or agreement, an assignment and a joint duty assignment. And they come in, they bring in practitioners, kind of real level, cutting edge experience. And they all have to have the same kind of high level clearance. And then the same thing occurs with our student body. So everyone asks, well, how much does it cost to go to your school? It's actually free. but it is very hard to get into.
Okay.
Because there's requirements. The requirement is you have to be somehow, it actually doesn't matter how, therein lies the trick, a full member somehow of the US government. You could be a reservist, so you're supporting obviously like the US Navy as a reservist. You could be part of CIA, you could be NSA, NRO. You could be, you could actually be in the Department of Interior, and somehow, very small number in the Department of Interior may have a TSSCI clearance, right? You could even be an NIH theoretically. You have to be somehow employed somehow with the US federal government, and you already have to have this top secret SCI clearance coming in the door. Now, if you have those things, and then there is, applications to our programs. So we have degree programs and certificate programs, and we also do continuing ed. If you meet those criteria, then you can literally come in and you could gain a degree and come into our institution. Now, I mentioned before, up until recently, we were at Bolling Air Force Base at DIA. Many, many years ago, NGA, for those that don't know NGA is the National Geospatial Intelligence Agency. They're known, basically, people used to know, they're the mappers.
Yep.
They're really known for geospatial intelligence. They used to have a campus up in Bethesda, and then they up and moved that campus, that location, down near Fort Belvoir, which is in Northern Virginia.
Okay.
Now, the government had to figure out what to do with it. Congress had to figure out what to do with that area. That's actually right over the border of DC, over in Bethesda. So close to the Potomac River, they had this federal space. And so some people decided that they were ultimately going to create an Intelligence Community Campus Bethesda. We call it ICCB. And so they built this campus, and everyone there is in some way, shape, and form like a center for common concern. So we're all centered on that. So the elements that are there either through the Office of Director of National Intelligence, or they're from DIA. So the two from DIA are both Service of Common Concerns, support the whole community. And we all ended up moving to this very unique complex they call a campus in Bethesda. And we got our own building. Our entire building is a SCIF. It's one big, massive SCIF. It's several floors. And we have these incredible partners right down the hall from us, that include members of the community that we get to engage in on a daily basis in a number of great different ways. We bring in invited speakers. We literally just reach out and see them in the hallway. We see them, getting coffee. Go, hey, you want to speak to my class? You have an awesome experience. You're coming from NSA. You're coming from DIA. This is exactly the kind of areas our students want to do research in. Maybe we can network and get some unique data. And we do that, and we have the full access if you can get in the door. Now we have other kind of campuses. We have centers and nodes in other parts of the country as well as the world. But all of them have to be essentially like what you see in Bethesda. They have to be SCIFs. They have to meet certain requirements.
Got it.
And then in between all that, we have accreditation requirements like any academic institution that we're constantly, kind of struggling to understand and try to meet those requirements in between all of that. And so that's what our environment is. But we have classified educational material. We have highly classified theses that have incredible impact because we can do that. That may never see light of day, but they do support our community, and we have an enormous amount of fun doing them.
Yeah, I can imagine.
It's very, very risky, but very high reward and high impact. And that's the kind of culture and that's the environment that we're in. So that's the kind of long story short. The school was stood up. We had our first graduates in 2012. And then since then, we've essentially doubled in size in terms of the average output of students gaining degrees from my school, the Oettinger School of SNTI, whose functional kind of portfolio is this kind of SNTI world. And we've since kind of grown in that way. And then kind of lately, we're a little bit steady state, and that's not a bad thing because, we're like everyone else, we have a resource box.
Sure.
And we have a staffing box, and we have to work within that box, but constantly keep our hand on the pulse of the community because we support a practitioner's world. I think the closest analogy, academic analogy we have, believe it or not, is an MBA program.
Okay.
As you think about
Sure.
MBAs, when you look at their faculty and their staff and their students,
Yep.
incredible interdisciplinary when you bring those students in. I mean, some have business degrees and economic degrees, some have science degrees, some are coming from industry, some are coming straight from academia. If you look at the faculty, so I participate in a continuing ed program at Northwestern with their great, their folks in Kellogg. And when you look at faculty, it reminds me of our faculty. I go, well, you have these kind of, you know, something closer to like a tenure track faculty that's a newly minted PhD that has a little bit of experience, and they know that kind of academic side. At the same time, they bring in practitioners. So I mentioned McKinsey before. What do you want to do? You want to bring in someone who worked at McKinsey for 20 years that knows the business side of the world, that may only have like a master's degree.
Right.
And then you bring them in, and then they complement each other in the classroom in terms of a unique diversity of experience. Well, the same thing happens with our faculty. We have folks that got PhDs that have kind of national security experience, maybe heavy academic experience. At the same time, we may have someone who only has a master's degree, but just came from 20 years at CIA and has this just incredible operational experience that you want to bring in as well. And the same thing goes for our students. Our students are at the moment, it's a little bit military heavy. It's for the school, it's what, over 60% are military students. They're about mid-career. Our students are about 36 and a half years old. That's the kind of students we have. There's a bell curve around that. But we bring them in, and who do they become? So the current director of NSA, General Nakasone, is an alum.
Okay.
General Hayden, who's all in the news, he's an alum. The current director of the Defense Intelligence Agency, General Ashley, he is an alum. That's not the only ones. There's a lot more out there, most of whom you'll never know are alum. Partly because of identity crisis, we have too many different names in our history, but also because that's the world we live in. A lot of our students, frankly, and staff don't necessarily want to be as public as me, and that's okay. But that's who we are. Now, I mentioned there's a big transition, and then we'll kind of go to the next question.
Sure.
Big transition that's historically unprecedented. So if you look at federal academic institutions, you know, you go to US Code, and much like us at the moment, they're what's called defense schools, and they're stood up in US Code under Title X authority.
Got it.
Right, so National Defense University is a defense school. You look at the war colleges, they're defense school. You know, the Secretary of Defense has degree granting authority. And this goes all the way back to essentially the institution of what we now know as West Point, right? The military school.
Sure.
Long established military school. And that is basically the norm for federal degree granting academic institutions. Well, we are slated, and this is now being codified in law, and particularly through like the SISI and the HIPSI and I think the SASC, if I have it correct. Don't call me out on that. But we are slated next year, so fiscal year 21, to leave the warm embrace of the Department of Defense and become the first fully what we call Title 50 institution aligned to the Office of the Director of National Intelligence. Okay, so this is unprecedented because one, all the federal academic institutions are defense schools under Title 10 authority. So what's the difference between Title 10 and Title 50? If you're U.S. intelligence, Title 10 usually aligns to what we call operational military intelligence. If you're Title 50, that aligns to very national, strategic level intelligence. And so that affects both your posture, your authorities, and your mission and what you're doing. And OD&I, much like CIA, is strictly a Title 50 institution that gains what we call National Intelligence Program money and has these very unique authorities strictly aligned to that. So if all of this works, you know, we got accreditors got to approve, Department of Education has to approve, the DNI, Director of National Intelligence, has to gain degree granting authority by law. Then we are slated to move sometime next year and become that first unprecedented academic institution. And we are excited about it. We are nervous about it because it's unprecedented and we don't know what it really means. But that's coming, you know, barring issues, and there's, you know, there could always be issues with these kind of things, but that's supposed to happen next year.
Can imagine.
Yep.
Fascinating though. Very, very fascinating history. Although my son, who's down the hall, taking his SATs now and applying to colleges, will be upset. But nonetheless, I'll explain that.
There's a path there. I mean,
exactly.
What's the path there?
It's not blocked.
The path there is you want to be someone who supports the government and is a person of service. Right?
Yep.
The military and Department of Defense and the agencies are people that value service and mission.
Sure.
And they find their way there, and then they find their way into a position that gets a clearance, and then they find their way in. So there's always a way to do it.
Absolutely. Yep. Absolutely.
Yep.
With the focus on SNTI and your job as dean, obviously you oversee quite a few different academic programs. I was wondering if you could sort of walk us through a little bit of, sort of a top line of some of these different baskets, some of that I mentioned the intro. And then, also, as you mentioned the profile of these applicants, I'm just been interested. Obviously, the things when we think about obviously PhDs in chemistry like yourselves would be very good at understanding chemical warfare countermeasures. Computer folks would be very good at cyber warfare. Maybe people from banking and sort of the sort of banking crimes and things. Are there any interesting things that we might not think about? Any roles in the humanities, historians, artists, anything that you might not think of that actually turn out to be really good at intelligence per se, or so the intelligence sciences and technology?
Yep. So, first of all, great question. I mentioned a little bit earlier, I mean, U.S. intelligence is a true smorgasbord of backgrounds and skill sets for people that come in. And to be frank, there's no singular background, educational set, or skill set that you couldn't find somewhere in the U.S. intelligence community. And in fact, in my institution, I'll start out like what our classic kind of portfolios are in my institution. So at the moment, we don't have majors. Like we don't have classic disciplines like other institutions. So there's no physics, degree. There's no English degree. There's no engineering degree.
Right.
Instead, we actually have concentrations. And concentrations tend to denote something that's very interdisciplinary, just like our community. So in the School of SNTI, and this has evolved over time, and it's still kind of evolving, we have a certain number of concentrations. We're still relatively small. The College of Strategic Intelligence is about 2 to 3 times larger than us, and really centers on what we call kind of geopolitical areas and military topics that you would find kind of social scientists kind of gravitate towards. But in the school, our topics range from literally a concentration in weapons of mass destruction. So yes, we have people that look at nuclear and chemical and bio and missiles, right? We have a concentration, it's called emerging technologies and geostrategic resources. So we look at emerging tech and we try to contextualize it in an intelligence and national security consequence, like why do we care about emerging tech? We look at geostrategic resources, why do we care about precious metals, like what is going on in China, and they have precious metals. Do we need to worry about that? These kind of things, climate change, resources, food and water, all this kind of stuff. We are concerned about that. We have that concentration. We have a concentration. It's easier for us. We're an awful world of acronyms. We call I3. It stands for Information and Influence Intelligence. So if you're in the US and you're watching the news at all, there's a lot of people that are concerned about what we call malign influence and information operations and election security and all these kind of things. And so in our case with that concentration, those are the kind of areas that we center on, but specifically from a US national strategic intelligence level. And it's really kind of a real wild assortment of things. So on the one hand, we might look at information operations and essentially how US intelligence community would do it, as well as the competitor space does it. We look at what we call classic denial and deception, right? So I want you to think one thing, but I'm really kind of masking or mimicking something else. I want to confuse you. We look at what do we do? What does our competitors do? And then really popular lately is what we call identity intelligence, right? So think biometrics, facial recognition, huge in the news. Now, in our case, we look at what the U.S. intelligence community does, and of course, we look at what our competitors, what are the threats, what are they doing, why do we need to care? So we have that concentration. We also, of course, have exactly what you would expect. We have concentrations in cyber intelligence, right? You can't really get around that. And we now have a concentration area in data science intelligence, because the fact is, it doesn't matter where you sit. Depending who you talk to, data is king. Now you have to contextualize why it's king and why it's important and why you're using it to reach certain objectives. But certainly the U.S. intelligence community, particularly through programs like Oettinger has what's called the AIM program, in which you're trying to automate certain processes based on real big data sets to either improve what the U.S. intelligence community is doing with the massive amount of data that has the legal authority to gain, right, or exploit and use for analysis. And then at the same time, understanding what our competitors are doing with that and why we need to care. So those are the kind of areas that we have within SMTI, but it's very interdisciplinary. You're not going to have someone that may look at just a WMD. In fact, we actually have you can get a dual concentration, because we realize a lot of these courses we can cross-list them based on the learning outcomes and how that kind of maps. And so everything, even to include something like biological threats, we have dual listed with emerging technology and geostrategic resources, because bio threats, as we know, is not just about BW. There's huge issues that we have to worry about in the national security context, about evolving bio concerns. The pandemic is a great example of that, but the health sector, the economic advantages from that, all those kind of things we have to worry about. And then for our degree, the school has one degree and we have certificates that map to the concentrations. We have students that work on different aspects of this, in support of the U.S. intelligence community. Now, in terms of background, I was fortunate early in my days, I was fortunate to have some really, really smart, to be frank, very aggressive, brilliant young women that were part of what I call the early days in particular of the Oettinger School of SMTI MSTI degree. And they put me in a really good spot, because when the school was young, the U.S. intelligence community is a funny business. Everything's transactional. You have to prove yourself on a daily basis that you're of worth or value to someone else. So if you talk, to be frank, with someone from NSA or CIA, you say, who are you? You can tell them whatever great background you have. It doesn't matter. You need to produce something that they value, and that's their value proposition for you. Oh, you actually did something, you helped solve some really wild challenge, and the output is really valuable to me. Now you're of worth to me, and oh, by the way, you're only of worth to me for a couple more days. You go back and prove yourself again. But we found was, we did a study. I basically observed the fact that in the school, even though a very small percentage of the Oettinger School students, something like 20-25%, depending on the year, were females, these students were frankly just crushing it. We would see them constantly winning our thesis awards. We'd see them winning our GPA awards. We'd see these female students always at or near the top of our class. And so it reached a point where we felt, one, there's something unique here. We think we have a story. Two, we need to study it, right? Do we think we see what we see? We need to try to look at that both quantitatively and qualitatively. And then most importantly, because we're a unique component of the U.S. intelligence community, right? We're dual-hatted.
All right.
We need to figure out how to translate that to particularly our functional area of SMTI. Right? What does this mean? Does it mean anything? And how does this translate? What we're seeing from these students. So we actually studied our female students. We came out several years ago. And what you looked at, and guess what? These female students, they all had completely different backgrounds. So one female student had a background in architecture. We had a female student that had a poli-sci degree.
Okay.
Ended up coming in, but she was a student at NGA. So she looked at imagery, and she was very good at imagery. And NGA has exceptional kind of training component. But she had a poli-sci degree. And she came into our degree program and said, you know what, I want to go work in a lab. I want to do bench work. Undergrad in poli-sci, very smart, highly disciplinary, very aggressive, knew what she wanted to do. And we said, you know what, let's do it. Let's see if we can get something. At the time, because we were Bowling Air Force Base, we actually had a relationship with Naval Research Lab, who has, bench chemistry capabilities. And we actually got her over there, and she scoped out a very unique, very S&T centric, research topic in which she had to go. We set up where she went to the Naval Research Lab, once or twice a week during her full-time program, particularly in the spring and summer.
Mm-hmm.
And she did bench work. And she did an amazing job to this day. She was able to articulate, the science. She was able to understand it, not a PhD level, but a very advanced level. She's a very smart person. She's willing to understand and embrace concepts that, many people needed a background and degree in, frankly. And then she was able to have a really clear output, and is a very well-scoped thesis in which she had experts from different communities helping her and produce this really high quality, to this day, probably the best heavy S&T kind of thesis I've seen to date.
Mm.
But the fact she had a poli-sci degree coming in. And this was not new. We saw people with, we have students that have PhDs in mathematics that come from Fort Meade. And at the same time, they're sitting next to people like her that come in and then do equally good work and sometimes outcompete them, because it's really as much about their culture, about what they want to do in service to support and have impact to the community, and their ability to embrace an interdisciplinary environment and just learn from a diverse set of people in this way that's just truly synergistic and really kind of magical, to be honest.
Sure.
It's kind of amazing because I came from a world kind of like you, where if you don't have a degree, you're not going to really know what to do. But that wasn't the case at all in many of these students. So they had degrees across the board, a lot of them poli-sci, but they embed themselves with other people, and the world was their oyster. If they were willing to embrace good feedback, they would embrace good networking, embrace the fact they needed other experts to bring in extra knowledge to complement what they had, then they had no problem doing it, and they did it, and it didn't matter what their degree or background was. And to be honest, that's not so dissimilar what we learn from U.S. intelligence community, what we call the functional areas. S&T analysts are, many of them are scientists, but not all. They come in, they learn it, and they do a great job with it. Certain ones do better than others if they embrace diversity of viewpoint, diversity of background, and are willing to work on these kind of areas in a way that you don't necessarily see in other places, although I would say it's certainly a little bit more trending in other places, but I've never seen anything like it like I do in our programs in our community.
Really neat.
Yeah.
Very cool. As we've been doing these shows, we some of the themes, sort of the emerging technology themes, things like artificial intelligence and machine learning, deep learning, they come up quite a bit, whether we're talking about developing new drugs or agro-terrorism, things of these natures, which are also themes that obviously you focus on. My background, before this, I come out of the pharmaceutical industry, and we have, aside from having to deal with cutting edge tools, we also have a regulator like the FDA that has to sort of stay ahead of the curve, so they know how to review the products that we're developing. In your case, whether you're having someone from the CIA or the Homeland Security Department or some very influential senator show up that needs some sort of the most cutting edge response or analysis of some issue, how do you, when you have to stay ahead of the curve where you are now, how do you do this in this environment? Because you are at such what I'll call the bleeding edge of stuff, intelligence-wise. What are some of the things that you do at the university to really stay at the bleeding edge of what's coming, whether they're cyber threats or chemical stuff or whatever?
So there's a couple different ways I'm going to answer this.
Please.
So the first is real academic response. So the academic response in my program, we realize there's this never-ending, we call it the laundry list of never-ending emerging technologies that comes out, right? Like everything these days is dual use. It's not like the old days where we could kind of figure out, look, that's for military purposes and everyone knows it.
Yeah.
It's just not clear anymore. And so we have these laundry lists that are just growing and rapid, but we have to prioritize against them, and then we have to keep pace with them, right? So how do we do that? Well, one way we do that's actually quite fun is that we tap into the ingenuity and innovation of our student body. So we have a course in my program. It's simply called MST 63 Advanced S&T. So what does that mean, and why is that important for this? So for us, imagine you're the senior most intelligence officer in the community. So in our community, that's actually known as the National Intelligence Officer, the NIOs. Right? Imagine you're that person. You come into a portfolio, and within no time flat, you have to brief, customers like the National Security Council, all the way up through the president and cabinet members. Maybe the members of the Sissy on the Hill, and you have to communicate it. But most importantly, you have to communicate it in the context of what we do within the intelligence profession. So it's not enough to say, this is a technology and a widget I need to care about. You have to communicate, one, actually, we think, we have nefarious competitors who are going to use this in this terrible way that's going to disrupt or counter us. We have to communicate, actually, this is a really big deal because there's IP theft and we're going to lose our economic disadvantage. And here's why we need to care. We constantly have to contextualize that in a way that matters as if we're in this virtual scenario, as if we're the senior analyst. And we communicate that in this course against that framework. And we say, okay, what you're going to do is we're going to give you a little bit of examples to start. But you are this bright young student that has this really unique experience. You're approximately 36 and a half years old. And you're going to actually lead this course, you and your students, both in team and individuals. And imagine you're in this scenario and you need to come in and actually, in an innovative way, not only communicate these kind of areas, but contextually in a way that actually makes sense as if you're in this position. But you can do it as innovatively as you want. And so what we end up seeing is, I'd say about half the students in half the cases come in and they probably touch on the class examples like data, we worry about data science, let's worry about machine learning, let's worry about robotics. But then what happens is these great young students come in and they come up with these, what at first glance are really wild scenarios around certain technologies, but they are bounded by the fact they have to prove to some extent, although notionally, why it matters to these senior level customers. And so on the one hand, we get a diverse kind of body of responses against the kind of classic cases. But at the same time, they bring up all these really unique ideas that we never would have thought of before that help complement the classic ones that we know about. And so it really is value added and synergistic. And frankly, it's one of the more popular classes because we let the students lead it. We go, well, what do you think? I mean, do we need to worry about, if we grow an organ in a lab, what do you think? Do we need to care? Why not? Bring it up. How do you contextualize this in this kind of way? And they do that kind of thing. So that's the kind of real simple academic one. And then often many of these students will use that. It really is an idea generator for their thesis. And then in their thesis, they'll kind of build on these kind of things and really dive deep on it. They'll see what the current kind of state of knowledge is through some sort of lit search. And then they'll kind of work against some sort of hypothesis in a classic way and try to justify it in a much more in-depth manner. Now, the other way is, this is, the nice thing about being dual-hatted as an academic and a U.S. intelligence officer. I mentioned before, we're U.S. Service of Common Concern. I have the greatest neighbors in the world at Bethesda. One of my neighbors is the National Intelligence Council and their technical committees. They have a number of technical committees that have portfolios that align almost perfectly to my academic portfolios. That's on purpose, right? Because we support them. And so what's great is, because of my position, particularly like the deans and in my case, the department chair, and it was actually the founding dean, Brian Shaw, really set this up. We have ex officio positions in some of these technical committees that are very high level under the National Intelligence Council. And the beauty of those kind of positions is that it's not a singular agency body. The Office of Director of National Intelligence, which the National Intelligence Council is under, is a community player by default. And they value diversity of the community. They value diversity, not only that of public-private kind of relationships in a very unique way that's just kind of built into their, not only the authorities, but the kind of ethos and culture. And so myself, my faculty, we're able to go to these meetings as ex officio members and sit with the entire community and frankly, listen to their challenges. And then the best thing is we're actually able in some of the working groups to bring our students in and say, hey, we got a student that's interested in this. Can that student come in and listen to these challenges, particularly in emerging tech, right? Because it's never ending.
Right.
And that's exactly what they do. So they're able to go to these things where participants, usually they know, they're like, wow, this person's going to end up asking me to be a thesis chair not too long later. And that's a good thing because we want them. And they literally hear from the who's who in the zoo on the alphabet soup on just about every technology issue there is. And then in some cases, we come up with our own through kind of savvy classes and things like this. Now, at the same time, the kind of unique academic hat is that I'm fortunate because our first name, Brian Shaw, he was able to find a unique way in which we could support the National Academy of Sciences. Right?
Mm-hmm.
Next to our own institution's mission, there's no one's mission, the scientist, national security, intel person, no one's mission that I love more than NIU's.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe like number 2 is the National Academy of Sciences.
Okay.
And so to this day, I say, God bless Abraham Lincoln, if those that don't know the history. National Academies, because the National Academies were born out of the Civil War and frankly, trying to understand and evaluate military technologies.
Yep.
Right? That's the history of National Academies. And we were able to find a way to participate and support several years ago National Academies. And some of the things the National Academy does, they have sponsors that come from my community and national security community, and they need experts, particularly academic and private sector experts. They can support them in these very unique, diverse ways on cutting edge kind of tech areas, but also national security portfolios. And we found a very unique place in which we could support that on both sides of the coin. So we can reach into our huge network in intel and national security and say, we have experts here and we know what the products look like. And I think this product could really help support your study on this emerging like technology threat. And at the same time, we can support other kind of ways in which we could sponsor other faculty members. And it reached a point, a good example lately is, luckily because we've, I think, done a good job with a couple of studies we've supported so far, like the Air Force Studies Board I was supporting. I'm now an ex officio member of the Army Science, the Army Board. It's a new board. It's kind of a reincarnation of an old an old Army Science Board. But the board, and you like it, acronyms again, is the Board on Army R&D Board, so BOARD.
Okay.
With a board. And we're able to serve in this unique role so the dean is an ex officio member in support of this board. So I do that. So much like my ex officio position in support of the community. So I'm not an analyst, but I'm an academic in sports community. In this case, I'm an academic supporting the National Academy studies and boards like that. But I do in a way in which I could reach back and sponsor some of my own faculty to support this, or I can get other members of the community and say, you really need to talk to this person because they're at the bleeding edge of this kind of technology in this area. And I think that would be great for this study. So we really use kind of classic academic, innovative ways. Use your students. They're the best resource. They're smarter than you.
Absolutely.
Far more, innovative than you. So let's hear what they got to say. Give them a good structure and give them a lot of latitude. At the same time, we use our unique position. And it's really kind of evolving in a way with these great places on the National Intelligence Council and these great places over the National Academies, in which we see some real good synergy to try to stay, at the forefront, which is really, really hard on many of these like hard technology challenges.
I can imagine. Thank you for that. Thank you. Continuing now, though, along the sort of the scope of threats, when one goes to the National Intelligence University website and go into sort of the publications that you have out there, obviously the things that come to mind, some of the things we talked about in terms of weapons of mass destruction and cyber warfare and so forth, but there's many very interesting publications that the university has made, very lengthy ones in fact, on topics like environmental contamination from oil spills, climate change, which obviously is an extremely hot topic on different fronts. So obviously I think about the different dual use opportunities as you've mentioned. Talk a little bit about why you research these topics, which seem a little bit, I guess I would think might be a little outside of national security, but obviously global security, they're clearly beyond our borders.
So I think you might be referring to a couple of, there's some books among other things.
Yes.
Out of our National Intelligence University Press.
Yes.
And those are PDFs, so you can find them. Basically, I'll give you a very localized example.
Please.
So first of all, just like any topic, it doesn't matter where you sit, academia, private, U.S. intelligence. The first thing is you have to just understand the history of some problem or some challenge, right?
Yep.
And it could be a very positive kind of issue. And then for us, of course, later we got our kind of wrap it in this kind of unique bow that relates to our community. But a great kind of unique example that is not well known about, in which we do that, and it's very unique to the school, Oettinger School of STI, is in fact the what's called the Intelligence Community Postdoctoral Fellowship Program. So it is a very small program. So for the most part, and actually there's some news that just came out recently that I'll allude to, but that counters what I'm about to say. But for the most part, U.S. intelligence community is not necessarily in the business of what we call basic R&D, like science R&D. We historically like in the business of like applications. We need an application to do better at X, right? Either analysis or collection or something like this.
Mm-hmm.
But there are a few programs. There's a program that's sponsored by the Office of Director of National Intelligence called the IC Postdoctoral Fellowship Program, in which there is, and it's a very small number, it's usually just over like 10, in which we sponsor a very small number of world-class U.S. postdocs at U.S. institutions. It can be either academic or it could be like a federal lab or a DOE lab, like P&L or a place like that.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And what happens is you have an IC advisor, you have an academic advisor, and you have a postdoc. So every fall, intelligence community members, so the full intelligence community, so the program is actually sponsored by the Office of Director of National Intelligence, is funded that way. Community members are, there is a request for information, and they say, okay, every fall, if you're a community member that's interested in trying to advise a future IC postdoc, put in a topic. There's a topic call, we put in a topic and it is literally centered on basic R&D. So there's clearly some kind of intel purpose behind the scenes, but the entire thing is unclassified. And we put it in, it goes through this kind of magic hoop, and some topics are approved and some are not. And then in the spring, it goes out on the street, through a federal site, and says, these are areas that this community cares about through this program. And if you're lucky, you get a whole lot of proposals that come back from US postdocs. Mm-hmm. And in fact, certainly in my case, I got very lucky. So many, many years ago, I learned about this program and I said, well, how do I participate? I'm an academic, can I get my own postdoc? And the answer was no, you're one of us, you're an intelligence officer, but you can advise because you'd be great because you're an academic. Mm-hmm. If that makes sense. And so once I found that out, I put one in. It was the first of its kind for my university. I said, I want to see if I can play, and then we can go from there. And I was very, very lucky. I looked back, I used my old history, but at the time, I had a real unique interest in cutting edge flexible electronics.
Okay.
I needed to know it. I wanted to know it. It's one of 1,000 emerging technologies. And what you find in emerging tech is sometimes the best way to understand a technology is to just fund someone the cutting edge to do it, drive it. And they're the ones who are going to give you the best responses to this, right? I got very lucky. I ended up getting a postdoc at Stanford by the name of Dr. Helen Tran. She's actually just finishing up her postdoc now after several years. And in fact, she worked on flexible electronics, and she worked in an area that was frankly, clearly is beneficial to humanity. Mm. In many ways, certainly at the surface, it's far more beneficial to humanity that maybe, I hate to say this to the sponsor, maybe more beneficial than to the US intelligence community. So if you think about the US pandemic right now, suddenly flexible electronics are back in the news. So think about health monitoring.
Sure.
So if you have a flexible electronic, you can put it, you wrap it around your wrist, you start to use it, you get diagnostics.
Yep.
Right? So all these things are actually very, very important things that we need to think about. At the same time, one of the most amazing things she was able to research and discover was a biodegradable semiconductor. Right? So think about that for a minute.
Yep.
There's huge implications in surgery, like post-surgery, like heart surgery. Like what if you had a semiconductor that was able, basically you have electronic, that was able to do, as a passive electronic, that was able to monitor certain things inside your body that only lasted for a certain period of time. And then it degraded.
Yep.
Right? Imagine now suddenly you don't have to have a second surgery. You got to come in, you got to take it out, all these kind of things. And that is in fact exactly what she did. And this has far more positive implications for humanity. She's got lots of publications that anyone in the globe can see. And she's done it a lot with the health community, particularly at Stanford and their medical, the medical experts. Now, at the same time, what did I get out of it? I got out, what is even the realm of possible in flexible electronics? I can literally reach out and tap this person and say, look, do I need to care about this? Why do I need to care? Maybe it's from an economic competitive standpoint. Maybe it's because look at the health industry is a huge industry that's growing. It's not quite like the old days where all we had to care about was BW. We have to care about biotech.
Yeah.
Right? There's a huge economic impact from that. Just like we know there's a huge impact, among many other things for whoever creates, the first, COVID vaccine.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
There's a huge kind of potential in here. But for me, I was simply able to tap this person to drive in a very small way, cutting bleeding edge basic R&D, truly, for them in a very positive benefits to humanity. But it helped me understand what's in the world of possible in this area, so that, if someone asks me, do I need to care about this? Why do I need to care? I immediately say, here's what you need to know about this technology. And I know because I have one of the world's most foremost experts that, we're funding their research, and now I know the academics doing it, and here's what we do. The same thing goes for those books. I think more recently, a good example, we reached to it, mid-September, basically about a week ago, I think my university, they sponsored or co-sponsored what was called the 2020 Environmental Security Summit. All right, so what do we do with our academic hat on as well as our IC hat on? We were literally able to bring together really the who's who from across the public and private sector to think and talk about everything from health and food, water and air resources, to the environment and security implications of public health issues, as well as kind of military and transnational security. We're able to do it with academics, we're able to do it with folks like from NIH, we're able to do it with National Academies, we're able to do it with folks from the IC, and really bring all these people together to gain, frankly, a far better perspective on all the different challenges that are out there, so we could at least understand it from our viewpoint if we're asked these kind of questions later. Because there's no way there's enough people and experts deep enough in any of these topics, within my community in which we think we're the experts alone. It doesn't work like that way.
Sure.
Sometimes there's only one or two deep on a topic, and we have to reach out, and we have to talk to all these people to gain a much better viewpoint of many of these things, and then frame it in the way that we have to do it.
I so enjoy hearing about not just sort of the fact that you're able of, to do things on the, to investigate these things that are on the bleeding edge, but at the same time, that you're not hindered by the typical stuff that you might find in a large corporation, or, fighting for resources with the team down the hall. Yep. It's a breath of fresh air, especially when dealing with these themes, and, having to stay, as I said, ahead of the curve, looking forward, really refreshing. It's been really eye-opening and really inspiring listening, not just to your story, but sort of everything that's you've been involved with, and how you're sort of ushering in this next step in the process. As mentioned early on in the intro, you highlighted folks like Dr. Amundsen, and as an important mentor, influencer from your past. Obviously, you've met quite a few people from academia, from military, from intelligence. It would probably take several hours to shout out to all of them, but are there some other folks that you might want to mention, shout out to at this stage? If it wasn't for them, Dr. Brian Holmes would be doing something completely different at this point.
Yeah, I would definitely say, certainly in addition to my family, there's definitely two people. I did kind of allude to both, but I'll communicate who they are and why they're
Sure.
important in my path, right? My both personal and professional path. And frankly, what I learned from them as I move forward. So the first was Dr. Bill Pennington, he's now actually the department chair of the chemistry department down in Clemson University, but I went there late 90s, early 2000s, and he was a member of the faculty in the inorganic division of the Department of Chemistry. And when I was really trying to figure myself out, and if I had a kind of career in chemistry, particularly grad school, to try to figure out if there's a place in which I could truly, frankly, use my strengths, and figure out what those strengths are, and then use them to the best of my ability. It really, frankly, started at Clemson, and with him. And what he did was, it was very unique. Was I came to him, and again, almost there's like a theme. I said, well, I think I'm actually going to take a very different path from what some of your own former grad students were doing, and I really kind of like interdiscipline. And he had a really good collaborator that was at the small private school in Greenville, South Carolina, called Furman University. It has a very good master's level chemistry program. And I said, you know what? They do some really interesting synthetic work. I know you don't typically do that. My advisor, Bill Pennington, was known for crystal engineering. And I said, what if I learned from him how to be a little bit of a synthetic chemist? I learned a little bit of a polychemistry. And then I applied it. We made our own really unique molecules that we then, do for the sake of very unique kind of crystal engineering purposes. And it was for his group, it was a little bit unprecedented. He never kind of ranged out of that, but he didn't hesitate. He said, yeah, let's bring you on. Let's try it out. And then, right or wrong, he gave me a very long leash. He gave me very wide parameters, but at the same time, he was always there for guidance. If I was just struggling, which if anyone's been through grad school, it's, I think we call, particularly PhDs in science, where you're a bench scientist, it's a marathon it's a marathon at a sprinter's pace, right? Every day is just kind of crushing sometimes. But he was always there to mentor me. If I needed help, I knew I could talk to him. We had a very good relationship. We were easy to communicate to. We had great respect for each other. And at the same time, he almost knew if I needed to be left alone for like 3 weeks, he just kind of knew it. And we knew that when I needed him, I would come back out and he would be there. And so he's open to all this. And it really helped me kind of find, a really good path in a way that I do not think if I'd kind of chosen someone else, I might not have what I had grown into. So he was a real mentor because of our relationship, frankly. Fast forward, the Oettinger School, I kind of say Brian Shaw, the founding dean of the Oettinger School, he gave me a lifeline. So I was in kind of a, strange position, a very good position, but a strange position for me. Wasn't sure what my future career looked like. He gave me a lifeline. I competed and gained a department chair position. And because of that, at the time, he was very visionary, right? He stood the school up. He had his vision. He actually had a strategic plan, which I actually like strategic plans. A lot of academic institutions, there's a strategic plan, and then it kind of gains dust. He had a strategic plan that really resonated with me. And most importantly, he said, we hire good people so that you can make us look good. And so I think ever since the day he hired me, my entire role, I almost want to say, was to justify the hire. I say, I want to prove to you this is the best hire of your life. Every single day, I'm going to work hard to be impactful, and we're going to push the limits, whether it's research or teaching or thesis work or engagement with the community or the information I use in our unique environment that you've never even thought of before. And we're gonna try to do that, and it's gonna be hard. But he let me do it. He gave me a massive long rope, but at the same time, much like Bill Pennington, he was always there. We had a great kind of communication with each other. To some extent, in hindsight, we're almost like the old married couple. Sometimes you have a very good relationship with each other, and you just get each other. You love each other, you hate each other. It didn't matter. You just understood each other in a way. It didn't matter. And we did that. We had great respect for each other, and just had a very unique kind of relationship. And he gave me these parameters, and he just said, "Go," and that's what we did. And I took just some awesome risks, because I had very good students who wanted to take some really incredible risks that were very impactful, that at the time was, to be honest, was not the norm in the university. I mean, we did some really consequential research in areas like explosives was one of them, in communications areas and things like this that at the time was a little bit contentious. In hindsight, everyone's like, yeah, this was great. Why wouldn't we have done this kind of thing with these students, and really push the students to a certain place, push the university and the school to a certain place, and frankly, gain that kind of credentialing that we needed to, and we constantly have to do with our supporters.
Mm.
But it was really because of Brian and the traits that he had that were very similar to Bill Pennington. And frankly, he was always supportive. So even when I screwed up, which I did all the time, he was the most supportive person in the world. And he said, look, here's what we did, here's what we got to do. And he would always come back in as a great leader, and we talk it out and we say, here's how we're going to keep doing things. And we would just keep doing it. And so I think, as leaders, if we can figure out ways to do this, or we give people boundaries and scope, if we're there for them, but also give them a lot of latitude, but aren't always, on them for mistakes. And
yep.
Unfortunately, sometimes we get on people too much for mistakes. I'm no different. But if we do that and have a very good communication system, which not everyone does, then that's the kind of best position I found myself in with these great people who were real mentors to me that I still am trying to learn from as I move forward.
Excellent message. Thank you for that. Really appreciate it. Brian, very, very inspiring stuff. I'm really wishing you the best as it moves forward and you transition to obviously the new structure, but really love hearing your passion, love hearing the story. For everybody that is going to be watching this episode or listening on the various podcast networks, you've been listening to the amazing Dr. Brian Holmes, Dean of the School of Science and Technology Intelligence, National Intelligence University. Brian, thank you for taking the time out of your busy schedule to come on the show. Thank you to our service to our country, to taking the time to make everyone more intelligent, to keeping the country secure, and dealing with these big bleeding edge issues that someone needs to focus on. So, and as we say on the show, thank you for moving the human story forward a little bit. That's a big part of what we try to profile here, but really, really impressive stuff, and appreciating your time.
Thank you. I appreciate the fact that you reached out. I appreciate the forum, and I look forward to any responses we get in the future.